Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this first ever virtual meeting of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Inevitably, started a little late, but thank you for your patience and thank you for joining us this morning. This is possible because of the coronavirus legislation that allows meetings to take place virtually, and it is being live streamed to the public in line with that legislation. Apologies have been received from Jeff Little and Steve Rumbelow, Chief Executives of Bury and Rochdale respectively. We have Lynn Ridsdale attending for Jeff. Moving on to item 2, Chair's announcements and urgent business. I'm going to bring Mayor Paul Dennett in a moment to talk about a recent government announcement on cladding on high-rise buildings. I should also say under this item that there is an item of urgent business that's been added to the agenda. The Greater Manchester Bounce Back Loans Report is in the agenda at item 16A, but will be considered as the final item on the agenda today. That's the Bounce Back Loans Report. I just wanted to start this morning with a brief update on the latest situation with the handling of the pandemic in Greater Manchester. Before I bring Sir Richard Lees in to talk about the latest developments on test and trace here. But I'll start actually by thanking everybody who was involved last night in an incredible event across Greater Manchester, the Together in One Voice event. Thank you to all of the big names who took part. There were so many people out on their doorsteps. And it was a moment to celebrate the way in which our communities once again have risen to the moment, supported each other through this crisis, and it was fantastic to see everybody taking part. I want to thank our portfolio lead on culture, David Greenhalgh, for all of the work that he did, Rose Marley as well, and everybody involved. I should also say, by the way, I want to thank David for the work he's been doing to ensure that young people who don't have online access have been able to benefit from cultural packs which have been sent out, 22,000 of them, working in collaboration with business, the arts and charities. An amazing effort too, so thank you for that, David. But of course we are in the middle of a very serious national crisis, and my thanks go to all of our council leaders, their council staff, all of the public bodies of Greater Manchester, our community and voluntary organisations who continue to work together to support people through it. In terms of the overall figures, we saw the best figures that we've seen last week with regard to the spread of the virus, the best figures since the start of the crisis. Still very difficult, and sadly a further 53 deaths in Greater Manchester in the period concerned. But the 349 new cases that we saw, this is related to Pillar 1 testing data, was certainly the lowest that we've received so far since the early days. In terms of numbers of people in hospital, the number of patients with COVID-19 in intensive care has gone down from 77 last week to 65 this week. The number of patients in non-intensive care beds, 591 compared to 673. Only couple of caveats to place on that, which sounds like it's all heading in the right direction, is the number of hospital admissions remains something that we need to keep an eye on. 25 daily admissions in the middle of this week compared to 18 the week before. And 28% of our care homes are reporting a case or an outbreak, only down slightly from 31% the week before. So grounds for optimism, but of course we remain cautious at all times. So I will leave it there for the general update, and I will now invite Sir Richard Lees to give an update on the latest developments with test and trace. Richard.
Thanks, Andy. Can I just add one thing to the report you've given? Because there was another bit of good news, I think, in last week's stats that this might sound an odd thing to say, but overall bed occupancy in hospitals was up. It was up quite significantly by about 9% over the week. And given what you've just reported about COVID beds going down, it does mean we are beginning to get other people returning to hospitals. And it's something we've both been saying publicly for some time, our concerns around a number of areas, strokes, heart attacks, presentations at A&E, paediatrics, cancer 2-week referrals. People have clearly been staying at home rather than getting in touch with either doctors or hospitals. If people are ill, they need to contact their doctor, they need to do something about it, particularly where there are potentially serious illnesses. I think lots of minor strokes, minor heart attacks where people have just not done anything and we need them to be doing something about it. But said that increase in bed occupancy is good news, although again, as we go through the winter, we have to maintain bed occupancy at no more than 80% because we have to make provision for any spikes or any other epidemics that, for example, a flu epidemic that we might get over the winter. Don't want to be depressing about what might happen, but we do have to plan for those eventualities. On test and trace, this is an absolutely crucial element of how we start to be able to return to what I think we would describe as normal things, including being able to gather more normally. And colleagues in health, environmental health, public health have been working really hard over several weeks now to develop both mass testing systems for Greater Manchester and a contact tracing system working in conjunction with a national system. We've been talking very closely to Public Health England and to government about how a national test and trace service ought to operate. And I think we've stressed that the local element is absolutely crucial, that when you get down to be able to follow up on cases, it's where the expertise exists and where people who don't have smartphones or anything else, the only way you can make contact with them. Seems that government have listened, and the system that they've announced was it will have as part of it, and an important part of it, a national contact centre, telephone contact centre. It is clear that the bulk of the work is effectively being devolved to local authorities, and particularly to directors of population health, who are being required to take responsibility in this. They will have to put in place, I've just lost this problem with using more than one screen. They will have to put in arrangements working with other gold emergency planning groups, so working with the police and other agencies, and establish a health protection board in order to oversee that. But it will be local authorities that are very much given the responsibility for this. Clearly in Greater Manchester, that the way to do that is through the arrangements that we've already been operating through directors of public health, environmental health coming together to develop the mass testing and contact tracing policy, and that is what we are proposing to do. The government's identified 11 areas to work with intensively to try and get systems established. Tameside, Steve Pleasant is clearly our lead on health, lead chief executive. Tameside are leading on behalf of Greater Manchester on that. And I know Brenda has attended a couple of advisory board meetings in that wonderful way. You find out with about half an hour to go that you've got a meeting to go to. So we have started work on the, well, we'd already started work. We started operating hours. Later today, that the health coordination group will be looking at the effectively the finances that are required for that, the staffing that's required for that. I think we are going to be talking about certainly a figure this year of over 10 million, probably nearer 15 million, to make this work for both testing and tracing. So there are going to be resource implications around this. And that's clearly, again, a debate to have with government. And there are some unknowns. Whilst I think we're very confident about what we can do about testing and what we can do about tracing, there are quite a lot of unknowns about managing the consequences and the ability to be able to do effectively what are being described as localized lockdowns. This is government uses the term local outbreak management, but effectively it is what you can do. You find a cohort of people who are COVID positive and have identified the people that they're associated with. So that's something we can work through as we develop the system. But I think having asked to be in the driving seat, we are in the driving seat, and clearly we need to make sure it works.
Thanks very much indeed, Richard. Extremely important update, and good to hear the progress that's being made in Greater Manchester. Critical to maintaining our grip on the virus going forward, and of course building confidence as people begin to return to some form of normality. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to bring Mayor Dennett in a moment to talk about the cladding announcement. Actually, just one other government announcement that I should mention in the interest of completeness. Last weekend, the government responded to our requests for support for Metrolink. Obviously, we've seen a huge drop-off in the fare box over recent months, and had received an earlier financial package which didn't meet all of our costs, around 3/4, and consequently we had been running a 20-minute service through April and into early May. We took a decision to increase that to a 12-minute service earlier this week. That was before last week's announcement, and that has been in place since Monday, and I think the right decision given the increase in passenger numbers this week. But we were pleased that the government announced last week that they would meet the vast majority of the costs of Metrolink up until August. A small shortfall, and we will come on to that under the finance update later on the agenda, but overwhelmingly providing the support that we need, which will allow us to increase even further from the 12-minute service that we introduced earlier this week. The only concern is that the package only runs until August, and therefore is quite a short-term package. We would prefer an arrangement similar to London, not in terms of the precise London deal, but in terms of the timescale for it, given that runs until October and gives more planning certainty in the long term. But obviously we will continue discussions with the government on that, but pleased to report a constructive outcome to our negotiations on Metrolink to the combined authority. With that, I will now bring in Mayor Paul Dennett to update us on the cladding announcement. Paul.
Thank you, Mayor Burnham. Really appreciated. I did send an email around to all chief executives and leaders this morning in connection with this agenda item of urgent business. On Monday of this week, the government announced its registration prospectus for the Building Safety Fund. Colleagues will probably appreciate that that was announced as part of the March budget of this year. Obviously, we're nearly 3 years on since the tragic fire at Grenfell, which claimed, as we know, 72 people's lives and injured more than 70 people. The email I sent round really details some concerns we have with the prospectus, and obviously as chair of the Greater Manchester High Rise Task Force, I wanted to act quite swiftly on some of the concerns that we're observing within the prospectus that the government's released. So just to give colleagues an understanding of what I'm talking about, we know that the size of the fund, which we know to be £1 billion, is only really estimated to cover the costs of probably a third of the 1,700 buildings, that's an estimated figure, that are caught up in the industrial cladding crisis. Also, the scope of the fund concerns us, because it doesn't seem to cover design and construction failures that aren't related to the cladding and the insulation itself. Government are also seemingly adopting within the prospectus a kind of first come, first served approach, which really concerns us. And obviously to apply for this funding, they're giving a window of the 1st of June to the 31st of July this year, which is an exceptionally small window and really concerns us. In addition to that, there are some restrictions on access. So residents who have commissioned work prior to the budget on the 11th March this year don't seem to be eligible. And we've already seen in the press and the media that residents at Skyline Central 1 who have combustible high pressure laminate on their building and have entered into huge loans, actually up to £25,000 per household already, potentially won't be able to access this £1 billion fund. So real concern over this. I mean, government have always maintained that, you know, residents and leaseholders shouldn't bear the brunt of the industrial crisis. So part of this is about holding their feet to the fire on some of this. We're really concerned as well about the impact on social landlords and local authority development programs and improvement programs for housing, if, you know, if they're not eligible to access some of this money. Government are still charging VAT on the removal and replacement in terms of remediation works, which does continue to concern us. And also this fund cannot be used to cover the costs of interim measures. We're additionally concerned about industry capacity, because government are requiring tenders to be in by I think December of this year. So there's a lot of work that actually has to take place to support this moving forward. And then finally, we're really concerned about the height restrictions. You'll note in the prospectus that there's a 30 centimetre variation upwards or downwards from the 18-metre height that government often talk about in terms of constituting eligibility. So anyone who doesn't fall into that threshold is not eligible to apply for funding here. So all of those are our initial concerns after reading the prospectus as the High Rise Task Force. What I'm proposing is that we, as the combined authority leaders and yourself, Mayor Burnham, write to the Secretary of State on this issue as a matter of urgency, and we continue to support our residents within Greater Manchester in lobbying and campaigning and influencing. I mean, it's nearly 3 years on since the tragic fire at Grenfell. You know, we've seen a lot of dither and delay on this agenda, and actually, you know, government really need to come forward with the funding urgently to support our residents in what is an industrial crisis. So if colleagues are happy, I'll draft a letter and we'll get that off to the Secretary of State as soon as possible. And if we can continue to support residents in GM around this agenda, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul, for all of your work on this. And I think we all need to recognise that it's been challenging for everybody to stay at home, but particularly so for people whose homes aren't safe because of the cladding situation. So your support for people is hugely appreciated at this time. And, you know, I'm sure that the CA and myself will want to support you in making this approach so that we get a resolution that is fair and deals properly with the issue. So thank you very much for raising that, Paul, and I'm sure it'll be appreciated by residents affected across Greater Manchester.
Thank you.
Colleagues, let's move into the agenda proper now. Item 3, declarations of interest. You know what to do. They should have been completed in the normal way, and if they haven't, please do so. Item 4 is appointments to the GMCA. It's a very pleasant duty to be able to welcome Councillor Eamon O'Brien, the new leader of Bury Council, to his first combined authority meeting. It won't always be like this, Eamon, and it's a shame we can't congratulate you all in person, but it's great to welcome you to the as a member of the combined authority. We wish you well. We're here to support you in any way that we can. But I think we would all like to send our very, very best wishes to our good friend, Councillor David Jones, who did an outstanding job leading Bury through the last couple of years, and we're really appreciating everything that he did to support the work of Greater Manchester, particularly his work on young children and young people, and we're all deeply grateful for that. The second appointment to note is the appointment of Councillor Nigel Murphy as the substitute member of the GMCA for Manchester City Council. And this appointment, of course, arises because of the sudden and deeply saddening loss of Councillor Sue Murphy, a great friend to us all, the loveliest of people, the kindest of souls, who gave great service to this combined authority and indeed to the people of Greater Manchester. She is much missed. We know Nigel will be an excellent replacement, but it's hard, obviously, to lose a good friend such as Sue, and it's fitting that today we will come to an item on the agenda, A Bed Every Night, something which Sue worked with me on to build, and I can't think of a more fitting way of marking her contribution than hopefully passing that funding package today to set up phase 3 of A Bed Every Night. So welcome to Nigel. Moving on, colleagues, item 5, appointments to GMCA portfolios, overview and scrutiny committees, GMCA audit committee and transport for the North. You have a paper which sets out all of the changes which we're asking you to note. This enables the reconstitution of a number of our committees, but the report was revised and recirculated yesterday, reflecting updated nominations from districts to GMCA scrutiny committees. Just wanted to alert colleagues to that. I don't intend to go through all of the recommendations. You can see them set out in the paper. Can I ask colleagues that they be agreed?
Agreed.
Well, I was going to take silence as assent there, but thank you, someone, for coming in. And I should say this is the first public opportunity I've had to thank Lord Peter Smith for all of his excellent work leading the health portfolio over the last few years, for a number of years actually, steering health devolution in Greater Manchester through its earliest stages. So I think on behalf of everybody, thanks very much indeed to Peter. Let's move on, colleagues, to item 6, which is the minutes of the GMCA meeting held on the 14th of February 2020. Feels like a world away and a whole era ago, but that was the meeting we had. Grateful if colleagues could approve the minutes.
Agreed.
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 Brenda, Elise, moving on to item 7, we're noting scrutiny, overview and scrutiny minutes from corporate issues and reform of 11th of February and planning, housing and environment 13th of February. They to be noted. And then item 8 is a report on decisions taken under delegated powers during March to May, and the report is attached. And we bring this to you very much in the interest of accountability and transparency. It is, of course, unprecedented that we've had to take a number of decisions in this way, but I hope you will see from the report that it was essential that we did take those decisions. I'll bring in Liz Treacy, our GMCA monitoring officer. Liz, I don't know if you want to say anything about the paper.
No, well, only really to confirm, as you said, it was necessary to take decisions whilst the CA was unable to meet, and also just to confirm that the decisions and the reports were posted on the website at the time that they were made. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Liz. Just to recap, just to emphasise to anybody watching who's wondering why decisions weren't made through the normal democratic processes, these were decisions that needed to be taken to enhance our response to the crisis. For instance, the creation of a temporary mortuary, the emergency grants to the voluntary sector in Greater Manchester, funding for our disabled people's panel, which has provided a crucial voice for disabled people throughout this crisis, funding for Greater Manchester to procure its own protective personal equipment, the free Metrolink we provided for NHS staff. I mean, I won't go through the whole list, but colleagues will see that there's some incredibly important decisions that needed to be taken in there. And we're just asking colleagues today to note that these decisions were taken under delegated powers. And as I say, it's in the interests of transparency and accountability. Okay, colleagues, if that's noted, let's move on to item 9, which is recovery response. This paper sets out in a broad way how we go forward from here, what the Greater Manchester response to recovery will be. And as you can see, it breaks that down into 3 phases: the kind of 0 to 2 month phase, which we're in at the moment, which is the release from lockdown phase. Secondly, going a bit further forward, a living with COVID phase. That's in a phase where there is more liberty for people, but while we still don't have a vaccine or effective treatment for COVID, making sure that we manage things. And obviously Sir Richard has updated us on the test and trace system, which will be so crucial in that. And then looking to the longer term, the whole notion of building back better, which will be at the heart of the Greater Manchester response. How do we use this moment as a reset moment to change, to see things differently, change what we're doing, and come back with enhanced approaches in a whole number of ways, restarting the Greater Manchester economy and society in an even better, fairer way. There are many examples on the agenda today of how we are going to build back better. We're about to discuss a clean air zone for Greater Manchester, covering our 10 boroughs, minimum taxi standards, a bike hire scheme. There has been a huge effort across our boroughs on cycling and walking over the last few weeks, and emergency powers there. So build back better isn't a vague phrase. I think we can begin to see how it's taking shape. And all of the developments that we are discussing with regard to clean air would be part of a reformed integrated public transport system, which again remains a clear ambition for Greater Manchester, and actually one which we intend to accelerate in this period. But as you will see, the report also talks about the inequalities that have become so blatantly apparent to all of us through this, in terms of the financial and employment status of so many people in Greater Manchester who've been out keeping our shops working in our care homes, who don't necessarily enjoy the same employment security as others. And we feel this moment has really exposed the divides that we have. We want better jobs for people, more secure jobs, greater prosperity for all. And this whole notion of how we build back better by tackling these inequalities, again, will be at the heart of our approach, with the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter centre stage, as we link it to public procurement and make sure that as far as possible we build back through our own Greater Manchester companies and ensure that they benefit as much as possible from investment in the creation of the clean air zone and other developments that we're bringing forward. Of course, there are other strands that we want to develop. Business confidence is crucial, and you'll see reference to a safe GM stream of work. That, of course, is linked to test and trace, but also to how we manage the reopening of retail in the coming weeks. Safety must be at the heart of everything that we do, so that we build that confidence to bring people back, particularly to the city centre, bring back those international visitors and international students. So, colleagues, this is a very high level description of how we intend to go about this work. Of course, there will be much more detail to follow, but I think it's helpful to set out this framework as we begin to approach what will be a monumental challenge of getting back, but not just getting back to where we were, being better than where we were, and that will be at the heart of the Greater Manchester approach. So, colleagues, unless anyone wants to come in on this this item, I think I will turn to a specific way in which we're going to build back better, and that is through keeping the clean air that we've all been enjoying in recent weeks. This is, of course, a moment now to move forward on our clean air zone, and you'll have a paper under item 10 setting out the proposals, not just on proposals for our clean air zone and the business support that will go alongside it, but also to bring in minimum taxi standards in tandem with the proposals for the clean air zone. Now, we recognise the pressure that's been on our businesses, particularly on our taxi companies and taxi drivers in recent times. So we are coming back with enhanced proposals for a clean commercial vehicle fund of a bigger size to support small companies with vans. And we are also creating a hardship fund, recognising that some companies will need particular support and some individuals will need particular support to change their vehicles. It being our objective that we don't lose a single job or a single business as the result of the creation of a clean air zone in Greater Manchester. Councillor Andrew Weston has done fantastic work in bringing us to this point. On behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for your leadership on this, and hand over to you to take us through the detail. Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew. So obviously it's been a while since we met, so just to remind colleagues really that the government have required us to establish a CAS-C clean air zone, which is all but personal cars effectively to be charged within the city region, in order for us to achieve compliance in terms of our nitrogen dioxide emissions at the roadside by not later than 2024. This is quite a detailed report, and you will have noticed that there are 12 recommendations within it that are quite varied, but the substantive points really to bring to colleagues' attention are an update on funding, as you just said, Andy, our requests for further funding, but also to update on the first tranche of agreed funding that we have beyond just implementing the zone, so support for those affected, an update on consultation and implementation, particularly in light of COVID, because there has been a material impact there, and then the link, as you said, to minimum licensing standards and what that means to the consultation there, but also crucially an indication of a roadmap towards achieving a zero emission taxi fleet by 2029, which, as you say, with a view to building that better, is absolutely crucial to our work in that area. So I'll start off with some good news. On the 18th of March, we received a letter from Rebecca Powell, the Minister, who confirmed that, well, a couple of things really that we should welcome. Firstly, that the request that we had submitted for an exemption until 2023 for light goods vehicles within the CAS-C clean air zone has been agreed. That's really important because we had substantive concerns that we would not have sufficient depth in the second-hand light good vehicle market. So another couple of years there, or in order for the market to develop, I think will be really welcomed by those who are impacted by the charge. The second, as I said, is that we have now received some, not sufficient, but some funding beyond just the implementation costs to support those industries affected by this. So we've received £41 million now by way of confirmation of funding. Just to be really clear, as you said, Andy, we have got in much more significant requests totaling 166 million. So there's a very long way to go with this. That includes, as you said, £98 million for a clean commercial vehicles fund, and also support to establish a £10 million hardship fund, which will be really important for those businesses that are particularly impacted by all of this. So yeah, progress, but it's very important that we don't lose sight of the fact that whilst we've had some funding, we've got nowhere near the amount that we require in order to deliver this scheme in a way that doesn't impact adversely on businesses and taxi drivers, buses as well, that will be affected by this. So mindful of all of that, we do, however, have the requirement to get on with consultation as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, COVID has had a necessary impact on our ability to do that, really. So it's very important that the consultation, when we go about that, is meaningful and wide-ranging, that we can engage as fully as possible, both with residents and businesses. And where that has left us in light of COVID is real concerns, both about achieving a meaningful consultation during a period of social distancing, but also about the capacity of businesses who are either operating in very different circumstances at the moment, or indeed in some cases not open at present, for them to engage in a meaningful way with the consultation. So what that means in practice, and we are supported by government in doing this, is that we've had to move back from our initial plan to consult in the summer to a point to be confirmed that is effectively as soon as reasonably practicable, to make sure that we can have a meaningful consultation. Clearly, it is still our intention to do that this year, and indeed government is expecting our full business case post-consultation by the end of the year. But all of that, throwing our sequencing out by a few months potentially, means that the implementation date for the clean air zone, which had been planned for 2021, is now pushed back to 2022, again with government understanding and support. It's important to recognise that whilst that is frustrating, the date by which we need to achieve compliance is 2024, and our modelling shows that it's not anticipated that there would be a material impact on our ability to achieve the 2024 deadline for compliance, which of course is the underlying factor here in terms of how we approach this. So quite a lot going on there. It is, as you said, really important to recognise that this goes far beyond just the Clean Air Plan and My Green Portfolio. This is critical to building back better, and our commitment to introducing the Clean Air Zone has not abated in any way, shape or form. Indeed, it's something that I know that all leaders are really keen to see delivered as soon as possible, as well as yourself, Andy. So this is about us making sure that we can implement the zone in a robust way with a meaningful consultation, and that we continue to press for that support for businesses. But as you said, it also goes beyond my portfolio in the fact that it has an implication for our consultation on minimum licensing standards for taxis. And that is because we do not wish to see taxis having to go through two phases of potential changes, basically. So it's common sense, as far as I'm concerned, that we say that if you're going to need to make changes in the Clean Air Plan, and as a result of the Clean Air Plan, and indeed there may be a pot of money available to help you do that, we should bring in our minimum licensing standards consultation at the same time and look to implement those tracking with the Clean Air Zone, so that taxi drivers don't need to go through that process of upgrading their vehicles potentially twice. As I said as well, there is this proposed roadmap through to a zero emission taxi fleet by 2029 referenced in the report, which is really exciting as well, both for the green agenda and of course for building back better. So I think that covers most of the key items within the report. I'm happy to take any questions, but it's just to reiterate that commitment that we do see this as critical to our work in GM to build back better, and we all want to move forward as quickly as possible. It is unfortunate due to COVID that we've got this slight delay, but I think that's the right thing to do, so that when we go out to our communities and to our businesses on this, people can engage fully in the process. Thanks, Andy. You're on mute, Andy.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much too for all of your work on this. I think you're absolutely right that it wouldn't be right to rush through a consultation when businesses are not operating as they normally would. We would have obviously liked to have moved more quickly but this is a really sensible way in which we can line all of our ambitions up together, as you say, on taxis as well, and come forward with a very coherent plan, not just to clean up the air, but to dramatically improve the public transport system. I know you're working on, you have taken some quite radical steps on cycling and walking in Trafford, and I know other leaders are doing the same. So it's not as if nothing's going to happen until 2022. The components of a reform system are being put in place now, and we're going to come on to one in a minute, the bike hire scheme. But I think this is the right judgment in the circumstances. Very much support your call for greater resource to support smaller businesses particularly affected. So thank you, Andrew. And I am looking if colleagues want to ask a question, and I have one from Councillor Brenda Warrington. So let me just line things up. Brenda, let's see if this works. I'm going to bring you in now.
Thank you very much, Andy. Can I first of all thank Councillor Andrew Weston for an excellent report, and obviously for the work that's been going on despite the COVID situation. It is essential. There is just one area that particularly impacts on Tameside that I just want to make sure is on everyone's radar. And that is, I'm sure people will know that Tameside borders with Derbyshire, of course, which is completely outside of the clean air situation that we're dealing with. But going through from Tameside through to Derbyshire, it's a very, very, very busy route, particularly for those huge articulated lorries that are making their way over the hills to the motorways. And at the moment, I know that discussions are going on. We've had meetings with JACU, TFGM, etc., to discuss the situation whereby the strategic road network links are actually exempt from the CAS. And that is quite wrong in our view. We need a response as quickly as possible, because we do need this situation dealing with. It's most untenable, because these huge wagons and lots of traffic are going through a very sort of rural area, through, you know, really village type roads, causing mayhem, quite frankly. But nevertheless, from a clean air point of view, it really is unacceptable what's going on, and for them to be outside of the clean air zone is just not acceptable. So I know that you're onto it, Councillor Weston, but I just want to put it on the radar that it is still an ongoing situation, and we do we're still waiting for responses. So I just want to make sure that that is on everyone's radar. Thank you very much.
Andy, you're on mute again.
I'll get there in the end, won't I? Thank you, Andrew. I've got David Greenhalgh indicating. And so if any other leaders would like to come in, then Andrew, I'll bring you back to answer Brenda's question, David, and anyone else who wants to come in. So, David.
Thanks, Andy. I just wanted, similarly to Councillor Warrington, really just to emphasise something that I think that needs to be clearly on the radar, and for us to be very, very clear on. It's something that Councillor Weston mentioned, and he's absolutely right to prioritise this, and that is the taxi private hire businesses, and also what we, anecdotally call, white van man, and both these, have a much more clearer emphasis. We were very, aware of these cohorts prior to COVID, but now these have been particularly industries, as it were, the self-employed, that have been extremely hard hit. And I do think it's absolutely imperative on us to be very clear with government about the level of funding that we require for our schemes. So it's a plea on both sides. It's a plea not only to national government to recognise this, which conversations I had is they are acutely aware of this, but it is also paramount for us to be very clear about what that level of funding is and what we believe is needed, that we can communicate very accurately with evidence based on what we need to deliver these schemes, because to me these schemes are under great risk if these two great issues cannot be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, David. I'm going to bring Andrew back in. I think the last point that you made is even more relevant in the climate that we're going into for small business. It was always going to be a challenge anyway to implement a clean air zone, but I think it's obviously going to be even more difficult. And that's why we need to do everything we can to get the support to them to switch vehicles. But let's remember, this could also, though, be then a help to those businesses if those vehicles can help them reduce their running costs. So there is a way of seeing this whole endeavour as a way of supporting businesses, if we can give them that help just to get them over the hump of buying a new vehicle and the upfront cost that will entail. But important issues there, Andrew. I'm going to bring you back in on David's point around business support, but obviously crucially the relationship with Highways England on all of these issues. So I'll bring you back in now.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'll just deal with Councillor Greenhalgh's question first, because he isn't entirely right to make the point about both taxis and LGV drivers. As I said, I really welcome the exemption that we've got until 2023 on the LGVs to help the second-hand market develop. But you're right, in light of COVID, there has been a significant impact on those two categories impacted by the Clean Air Plan, in particular in financial terms. One of the things that I will say, in fairness to Rebecca Powell, the Minister, is that in addition to the 41 million that she confirmed in the letter on the 18th of March, there was a written commitment to further funding coming forward in the next few months. I do have a slight concern with that, in that she has determined that that will come forward once they know the details of our scheme. And this is a little bit chicken and egg. We would like to tailor a scheme in accordance with cognizance of the full financial package that might be available to people, but they're saying we need to see what your scheme is to understand the impact on the affected categories. So I'm confident that we will secure significantly more funding than that we've received already. Unfortunately, I can't go further than that and say that I think we'll get all of it, but certainly my position has been to make it very, very clear that these numbers are modelled, that there is a reason for the figures that we have requested. They've not been plucked out of the air. It is significantly critical to the project, really, that we get that funding in. So just to give you an assurance, Councillor Greenhalgh, that I'll continue pushing for that, but also working constructively with Jackie and with the Minister, because there has been that movement in recent months, and that is welcome. Just turning to Councillor Warrington's point, and there are a couple of issues here. So first is the general principle about the strategic road network, which has been a frustration with this for all of us from the outset, really, that we are being asked to deal with these exceedances at the roadside. And if you look at the GM map at where the majority of those exceedances are, they are all adjacent to motorways in most cases. Certainly the worst area in Trafford is where the M60 comes through Stretford and Sale at the River Mersey, and meets the A56, which, as Andy says, may be slightly cleaner than usual because it's now got a cycle lane running through it, but actually it points to the significant impact that the motorway network and the strategic road networks having on our capacity to deal with the clean air issue more readily. We've told the government if they're not prepared to deal with it, we would happily deal with it at a local level, but we don't have those powers at the moment. But there's a specific issue that Councillor Warrington raised with regard to the routes into Derbyshire and over to Sheffield, I would think, as well. So the first thing I'd give is a verbal assurance that we have told JACU very, very clearly that we will not be able to progress this without a resolution to that issue. So they are well aware of our position on that. It is recognised as a real problem. And then also you're aware that we are looking at the specific issue with the boundary in Tameside as well, that deals with some of the problems there around access in and out of the borough. But yeah, I mean, the assurance that I give is that, as you said, it is very much on the radar, but we have been as tough with Jacko as we can be, that we've made it really clear that we can't progress without a resolution. So I hope that gives some assurance, Brenda. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. I think Eamon had a little bit more specific information that may be of interest to Brenda. Eamon, am I able to bring you in? Or can you?
I haven't a clue.
I think if Brenda can hear you, maybe just I can hear you, Eamon. So I think everyone can. Yeah.
And just a small addition to the point which Councillor Weston has made. We are in active discussion with DfT specifically over two related issues. One is the Transpennine goods issue and the movement of heavy vehicles, as you rightly say, on the Transpennine routes through Tameside. But also we've got specific discussions underway with the department about including your long-awaited and much heralded Mottram bypass, which is due to be delivered in the next investment or this current investment period. Which under the traditional rules would have been excluded from the CAS, but we've been given a commitment that it will be included. So that's still ongoing work and yet to be concluded. But that's where I understand TFGM are with DfT at the moment.
Andy, you're muted.
I don't know why that keeps happening, but I'll get used to it soon. I was just saying thanks, Eamon. Some good news for you there, Brenda. And thanks again to Andrew for a very full update. And I think what you're getting here is a very big green light to proceed on the basis that you've outlined. So, colleagues, if that's agreed, you've got the recommendations in the report. Can I ask that they're agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you. We're commending the position that GM local authorities will move to a statutory public consultation as soon as possible, and the further details are set out. So thank you very much indeed, Andrew. And we move on to a related item, which is item 11, Greater Manchester bike hire procurement. Of course, what we want to do is move to a situation where we are giving people many more options to commute across the city region. And there has been a long-held ambition in Greater Manchester to have a bike hire scheme. We all remember the Mobike scheme, which gave us some valuable learning, but was not introduced in the way that we would have wanted. And so we're coming back with a revised proposal based on that for a docked bike hire scheme, unlike the Mobike scheme. And of course, that would have implications for local authorities and districts. We want to work with you to make sure we get those locations right. And that will be part of the proposal that we hopefully will bring forward from today. As you'll see in the paper, this is a £10 million scheme initially that will be focused on the boroughs in the regional centre, Manchester, Salford and Trafford, very much supporting a first mile, last mile active travel approach in an integrated public transport system. And of course, we have the clear ambition of creating a London style public transport system of single integrated payment, and I would want the bike hire scheme to be part of that. But I would want to assure leaders in the other 7 boroughs that I very much want to see a phase 2 of this scheme. It would not stop at phase 1, and we would want to see the same option afforded to residents across the 10 boroughs. Very much kind of noticing that we're moving on with plans for enhanced cycling and walking provision through the B network, but some of the temporary measures that colleagues are introducing. and it's the introduction of that segregated infrastructure, I think, that will see a significant increase in demand for a bike hire scheme as confidence in active travel builds. We've seen a big increase in the number of people cycling across Greater Manchester in the last couple of months, and of course we want to do everything we can to preserve that and give people alternatives to the car, recognising that public transport is going to be under significant pressure for some months to come. So the details are set out, colleagues. What we would want your support on today is to issue a contract notice pretty much straight away that will invite, obviously, expressions of interest. That would be reduced to 3 potential bidders by the end of June, so we do want to move quickly, and then a final decision on a preferred partner for a bike hire scheme in either our August or September meeting. This would allow for a decision to be taken at that meeting, then with an introduction of on-street provision in the spring of 2021. It's a scheme that I think that is very much of the moment. It would create around 20 jobs, and that's something that I think needs to be noticed too, and funded, as I say, from the Mayor's £10 million from the Mayor's Challenge Fund. So, colleagues, this is just an attempt today to get the process going and moving quickly. It's not an actual decision today, but we're looking for you to endorse the procurement process that I've outlined. So asking colleagues if anyone wants to come in to ask a question or to make a comment. I can see Councillor Brenda Warrington. So over to you, Brenda.
Thanks, Andy. Very much welcome this report and look forward to all of the districts having this facility. It will be really, really good. Obviously, you know, we want to see it in the city centre, but we want to see it everywhere else as well. And if you're looking for any of the districts to do any kind of a trial or pilot, then I'll offer up Tameside immediately. The one question I do have, though, is that we know that what's happening throughout the UK at the moment is that there is a shortage of bikes. I think manufacturers are at the point where they can't make them quickly enough because of the demand for all the reasons that we know about with public transport and COVID, etc. So I just wonder whether that might indeed hamper our ambitions on this one, or whether we have any kind of arrangements that we could look to make sure we get the bikes actually available as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Brenda. Also got Sir Richard Lees. Richard.
So first of all, I support the proposal. I think a scheme like this is a great step forward, but I want to really put in a plea on behalf of pedestrians, because nobody lobbies on behalf of pedestrians, but they are an increasingly important part of mobility. Just a couple of figures to back that up. One comes from TFGM's own data on modes of transport people use, and I'll take trips into the regional centre. There is data covering other journeys as well. But in morning rush hour, that 2% of journeys in 19 were cycle, 13% were walking. And that 2% goes down to 1% between the hours of 10 to 12. So then the 13 times as many people walking as there are cycling. That morning rush hour, by the way, 64% were people using public transport. And this is still the biggest issue that we face, is how we increase capacity in public transport to allow people to continue to travel. And I say that because of another set of figures, which comes from survey figures, but this is survey figures from Transport Focus, which asks the question that people who used to use public transport, what are they doing instead? And of what they're doing instead, 4% are moving to cycling, 18% are moving to walking, which is good. 27% are moving to driving, which is clearly not good. And I think we're in real danger, really, of moving very rapidly to a position because of the switch that's taking place into use of the private car. And it is nearly all one person in a car that we'll move back to high levels of congestion and pollution very quickly. So I support this scheme. I think it's a good scheme, but I do think that we need to have a more rounded approach to overall modal usage. For me, getting people safely back using public transport's got to be the biggest priority, because mass transit can only move the sort of people, a number of people we need to be moving around. But the reason for speaking in the first place was not about public transport, it was about pedestrians. There has been a massive increase in the number of people walking. They don't get much attention.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Brenda. Brenda, on your point, I've certainly had this conversation with Chris Boardman as to whether or not we could introduce other schemes that help people get access to bikes alongside the bike hire scheme. There is a successful bike to work scheme that employers offer, which provide interest-free loans to help people get a bike. I'm wondering whether we could make that available to people more broadly, perhaps to those who aren't in employment. There are schemes being operated with, I know there've been one with the NHS in this period where bikes have been provided to companies. And obviously there are bikes that GMP confiscate or have. So I think we need to have a look at it. Absolutely. I know there are significant challenges in getting to bike repair shops at the moment. There's long waiting lists. So, you know, the supply of bikes is something that I'm very much looking at, and we'll be working with our cycling and walking commissioner to see if we can do something about it in the short term. But that would be, of course, alongside moving the bike hire scheme forward as well. So thank you for your points, absolutely taken on board. And Richard, completely agree. I think the objective has got to be to cater safely for every form of travel, pedestrians, cyclists, and then obviously other forms of transport. And I think the Oxford Road scheme is probably the one in Greater Manchester that has come closest to really kind of laying out a template for how we do that safe space for everybody. And I agree that that's where we should be going. I know that districts have got work underway to increase pavement widths to help people keep social distancing when they're out and about. I also just want to update colleagues on a discussion that I've had with transport ministers, because I kind of foresee a challenge here where the road space is going to be highly contested with all of the change that we might see. Hopefully not, but probably an increase in cars. How do we manage all of this in the interests of everybody? And I think this means that we need to renew our call for more power over the highways system with regard to enforcing yellow box junctions, managing utilities, but also pavement parking, which it is a significant concern of disabled people, older people across Greater Manchester, and very much inhibits their mobility as pedestrians. So I think there are a range of issues here, responding to what you say, that we need to build into our thinking in terms of how do we manage the highways and the pavements in the interests of everybody and create safe space for everybody. So the points that you make are indeed well made. So colleagues, and if there's I missed Councillor Greenhalgh. David.
Thanks, Andy. It was just a quick point, really, as we move forward, and hopefully, and as Councillor Warrington said, obviously into other boroughs and how they can be involved. I just think as well there is an angle here that, and I speak from someone who is, you know, not amongst the peak of fitness. I just think I don't really hear much mention of electric bikes, and electric bikes are a way in for a lot of people who don't see themselves as being able to commit, you know, totally with confidence to these journeys initially. And I just wondered if there is a step up and some step up measures we can be putting in and lead some initiatives forward. Because, you know, a lot of, as you get out into the other boroughs, you start to come across quite a few hills. And, you know, hills that will be hard for a great many people who are new cyclists. And that's where electric bikes come in. They can do the bits and gain that fitness on the levels that they feel they can do with some confidence, but have that backup when it comes to some of the harder inclines that many of us in our outer boroughs are very, very familiar with. So I think there is some initiatives there to actually encourage people who are not, you know, would consider themselves you know, amongst the most sporty amongst us, but it's actually encouraging them to participate and look at this as a realistic option for them.
Thanks very much, David. Well, having run the Oldham Half Marathon with Councillor Fielding, I certainly could see the case for electric bikes in Oldham, and I'm sure in Bolton, and I'm familiar with a number of your brews in Bolton as well, David, and I'm sure the same call would come there. I've certainly heard Chris Boardman saying that electric bikes should be part of the mix, and one question I will put to officers as a result of this discussion is whether electric bikes could be one of the options, could be part of the scheme, as well as maybe making them available via the other routes that I was mentioning before, possibly a loan scheme. So I absolutely agree with you that electric bikes open up let's call it an all-age cycling opportunity, and certainly in the steeper parts of our world. I don't know whether Eamon Boylan wants to add anything on that specifically, if there's anything to add, Eamon.
Just to say that e-bikes are part of the scheme. If you reference paragraph 2.3, it makes clear that a proportion of that fleet would be e-bikes. I'm not entirely certain what proportion that would be, but certainly we are very conscious of the fact that they've got an important role to play across a wide range of users. The other point I would make is in response to Brenda's query about availability of bikes to support the scheme. Confidence in the ability of the bidder to provide the fleet of bikes specified will be a key qualification point as we move through the tender process. So that's something that we'll have to satisfy ourselves on during that process. And I can confirm we've had a healthy response from a number of potential providers, the initial tender document. So we'll work through that, but certainly make certain as part of that evaluation that we're confident that the supply of bikes is there.
Thanks very much indeed. Oops. Thanks very much indeed, Eamon. I'm not seeing any further questions on this item, so I'm taking that colleagues think it's probably overdue that we got on with this. So yeah, a couple of nods there. So that's what we'll do, and it's going to happen quickly. And as I say, we want the scheme on the ground in Greater Manchester by spring 2021. And let me just say to all of the officers, I mean spring 2021, not as a spring meaning August or September. Let's really work hard now to get this scheme in place and capture the moment that we're in. So thank you very much indeed, colleagues. I'm asking you to endorse the proposal. I'm seeing plenty of nods from that, and we'll get underway straight away. And I assure the other boroughs we will be working to extend it to all 10 in due course. Moving on to item 12. This is the government's Better Deal for Bus Users fund, which we have a June deadline with regard to submissions, but it has been changed in the light of the new world that we're in terms of the thinking that we were applying to this. I'm probably going to bring Eamon back in to take leaders through the revised thinking. So let me just, I don't know whether Julie, whether you could line Eamon up to come back in again.
Need Eamon to put his camera on, Andy.
Eamon, if you could turn your camera on.
I was hiding from you.
Again.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Just very briefly, we reported to you in February on this initiative, which is a relatively small amount of money for investment in supported services. We've been working through a whole series of options with operators and in consultation with your transport leads, but clearly the whole bus market, the shape of the bus market has changed profoundly as a result of the COVID crisis. So what we're suggesting here is that we revisit all of those proposals in order to make certain that we've got a package that's fit for purpose. Again, we will do that in consultation with your transport leads, but to enable us to put a revised bid together that's supported by operators in line with the government's deadline of the 26th of June, which has remained constant. They've refused to move that. There are other initiatives announced as part of the package, which are all mentioned in the report. All electric bus town looks very attractive, but there is a very, very significant requirement for local and operator funding in order to lever in the government contribution. And while we will consult with operators on their willingness to put that capital investment forward, I think, if I'm being honest with you, that is not likely to happen given the current position of operators in terms of their revenues. And then the Superbus network, which is referenced, that proposal has been withdrawn, and surprisingly, we are not eligible to apply through the Rural Mobility Fund for any support. So we'll continue to work with operators on the all-electric bus town options, if there is any interest or appetite on the part of operators, particularly around funding. And we are seeking your approval to a delegation to myself in consultation with the Mayor and the Chair of the Transport Committee to develop a further set of proposals for the investment of the £1.58 million allocated through the government programme. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much, Eamon. So I'm asking if colleagues want to come in. I can see Elise indicating. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in. Let me line up Elise. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I just wanted to just ask that we're being asked here to delegate the final decision making, which is fine. It's just that the final routes that are decided, that those are the ones we want to submit. Could that be done in consultation with leaders? So can we see the list, that final list, before it is submitted? And that's really my only ask on that.
Yeah, thank you, Elise. I certainly will make certain that happens. But I would point out one of the things that we are trying to do is get some agreement with DfT about us being able to retain the money and use it flexibly over a longer period, partly because the market is in such a state of flux, and so priorities may well change and evolve over time. But certainly, in terms of any specific proposals that go in, I'll make sure that leaders are made fully aware of that before the submission happens.
Thanks, Eamon. Can't see any other questions on this, so I think that's approval for the recommendations set out. I should add, colleagues, of course, we were moving through our consultation and final decision on the nature of bus reform in Greater Manchester, and that was interrupted by the crisis. But I know it's a feeling amongst leaders that we want to come back to that whole question as we look at the changed way in which the bus market is operating in Greater Manchester coming out of the crisis. But the ambition for an integrated system, as I say, that operates on that London style principle is as strong as ever, and I'll be wanting to bring back to you a way forward on bus reform at the earliest opportunity, so that we can quickly pick that up in the same way that Andrew Weston has picked up the clean air proposals today. So we will bring those the way forward back to you as soon as we practically can in the next couple of months. So if there are no further questions on this, colleagues, I propose that we move on to item 13, a Bed Every Night phase 3. You'll recall, of course, the way in which our groundbreaking Bed Every Night scheme has developed since its launch in November 2018. Since then, it's helped 3,000 plus people hopefully move forward in life. Many of them have, and on the latest figures pre-crisis, the government's official rough sleep account, obviously we recorded a significant reduction last year, which is a clear sign that a Bed Every Night is working. We always intended to come back with a phase 3 of the scheme to start in July this year, and that remains our intention. But of course, like everything, it's having to be adjusted for the new world that we're in, and the proposals before you do just that. This is about creating COVID-safe accommodation for people sleeping rough or at risk of sleeping rough in Greater Manchester from July. And that will mean obviously commissioning slightly differently from our providers and working with them to change the layout of some of our locations to ensure the safety of people and the distancing that will be required within those locations. Of course, what we have seen since we last looked at this is the creation of the Everyone In scheme, and we've been obviously enthusiastic participants in that. Currently, over 600 people accommodated in hotels and other accommodation across Greater Manchester. But we remain concerned about the funding of Everyone In, and we're going to come on to that specifically under the finance update. We are in a position where we need, if it is to be the opportunity we want it to be, I think the government will need to provide more support to Greater Manchester to meet the costs of what's been provided so far, but also the successful transition of people beyond Everyone In to more secure options that can help them on their journey away from the streets. And obviously a Bed Every Night phase 3 is a crucial part of that. It's now more critical. It was critical anyway, but even more so in the current environment, keeping people safe and away from the streets. This scheme, this package that you've got before you today is £4.75 million to fund support for 445 households. So that meaning that some of the support is for couples, so could actually support more people than 445, but it would be 445 units of accommodation. I want to just flag up for colleagues that there is a specific focus on women only provision within this, 50 places, supported places that will be in women only locations. And that is particularly for women who've experienced trauma or violence. And we believe this is a significant enhancement on the earlier Bed Every Night phases. Also, some specific accommodation for LGBT people. Again, we think a step forward on what we've been able to achieve so far. 60 of the placements under this scheme will be funded by the Greater Manchester Mayor's charity, and this would be in respect of people with no recourse to public funds. It was a concern when the question was asked of the Prime Minister the other day around this issue that he didn't appear to initially see that there are people who can't be legally helped in this crisis because of their that status applied to their immigration conditions. I have to say this is one of the issues that the government has to sort out as it tries to make a success of the Everyone In policy. Having a policy of no recourse to public funds is incompatible with a government ambition of ending rough sleeping. You cannot have both, and therefore we want to see change to no recourse to public funds. But we also want to see an extension to the ban on evictions that we've had during this period. We want to see a continuation of the enhanced housing benefit through this period. We, as I say, want to see government giving more support to Bed Every Night, because 445 placements doesn't equate to the number of people that are still in accommodation in Greater Manchester and the people who are still coming new to the streets through lockdown that we've seen, which the government has so far refused to fund. But on the other hand, we do welcome the Secretary of State's announcement that he is seeking to create 6,000 new flats or homes for people coming through the Everyone In scheme, either as new build or modified placements, and Greater Manchester will want to work with him on that. We note his personal commitment to this issue. We welcome the appointment of Louise Casey to manage the transition, but all of that needs to be backed up by substantial policy change in the areas that I've mentioned, on evictions, on housing benefit, housing allowance, on no recourse to public funds, on funding for our local authorities, and funding to support a bed every night to manage this transition. But in any event, colleagues, this is an incredibly important step, hopefully, that we're about to take today, to put in place a structure that can support people through the accommodation they're in now, hopefully to a better place. I don't know if you've been seeing some of the reports of people who've benefited from our work over recent weeks by bringing people into hotels, but there have been some amazing stories in the media of the lives that have already been turned around. I think it's right for me again to thank all of our voluntary sector partners who've been working so hard to support people through this period. They've moved mountains and they've done an absolutely brilliant job. But now we want to capture all of the benefits for that and leave a lasting legacy on homelessness in Greater Manchester coming out of this. And that absolutely is an example of how we might build back better. I can see our portfolio lead, Mayor Dennett, wanting to come in, also Councillor Brenda Warrington. So I will come to Paul first, and then I will go to Brenda. Paul.
Just need to unmute
Paul. Paul, I think you're on mute.
Oh.
Can we unmute Paul, Julie?
There we go. Is that all right?
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Great. No, I welcome the work of Greater Manchester with regards to Bed Every Night Phase 3. For me, though, we have to see this in a broader context. Bed Every Night doesn't stand alone from all the work we've been doing through the Ethicals Lettings Agency within Greater Manchester, the Housing First work, and also the Rough Sleeper initiative that's been going on in all the districts. But you're absolutely right to highlight, Mayor Burnham, that this is about that broader agenda of prevention as well as tackling homelessness and rough sleeping as it presents to local authorities across Greater Manchester. I mean, just want to remind colleagues that at the moment we have almost 100,000 households on our housing waiting lists across the 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester. 30,000 of those households are in urgent need, and we also know since 1980 that more than 95,000 homes have been purchased under right to buy, and many of those homes have not been replaced. So, you know, I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement around the 6,000 new homes, but in terms of the demand, I think it's a drop in the ocean. And, you know, I am really concerned about the impact of COVID-19, one on the housing market, but also on the housing crisis. And, you know, I fear that the future may be more presentations to our housing option teams within local authorities. But in addition to that, you know, homelessness and rough sleeping really doesn't sit in a bubble independent of what's happening in the labour market, what's happening in the housing market, and what's happening with welfare. And you're absolutely right to highlight the issues around the benefit cap, the two-child policy limit. The increases recently in local housing allowance, although those are welcome, you know, they don't get us anywhere near to being in that kind of 50th percentile that we were in back in 2011. So more work needs to be done there. Also, you know, more work around direct payments to private landlords, you know, to try and circumvent evictions from the private rented sector here within Greater Manchester. And as you rightly highlighted, we need that humanitarian support for people where there's no recourse to public funds. We've also called for property size restrictions on housing benefit claimants to be relaxed during this period, because I'm really worried, I think, in the short term that we won't necessarily have the stock to meet the need within Greater Manchester, because it will take time for us to build more truly affordable housing here within Greater Manchester. But this is absolutely a fantastic step in light of some of the challenges we're already facing around having to step down from the everyone in policy and move people into COVID-19 compliant safe accommodation. So I welcome this work. There's lots more to do, and we mustn't take the foot off the pedal around the prevention agenda to tackle the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis here in Greater Manchester. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Brenda.
Thank you, and can I thank Mayor Dennett for the work that's been done on this. It really is a good news story for people that really are, some of the most vulnerable in Greater Manchester. Now, in Tameside, we actually have a really good team of people, working with our rough sleepers particularly, but obviously all homeless people. And, I think a brilliant job's being done, and I think, as you said, Mayor Burnham, pretty much a lasting legacy, and it's certainly something that you pledged when you first became the Greater Manchester Mayor. So I'm pleased that we've had quite considerable successes with this. A couple of things, that we've been looking at in Tameside, because a bed every night scheme, it doesn't stand alone, does it? It works with lots and lots of other support services that are needed, again, by people that need incredible support from us. And so we're able to offer that. We have almost completed, COVID has got in the way of it, I must say, but we've almost completed what will become a permanent feature in Tameside. We've invested in a community hub in Ashton-under-Lyne with partners, and that will be a permanent ABEN hostel, and will also provide other services so that we hope we can help people, support them to move on, to do other things. And that has actually been very successful for us, where quite a number of people have been supported to actually have their own homes now, in fact get jobs as well. So we've had quite some successes with that. But what we are now looking for is, we feel in Tameside that we're at a point where we shouldn't be looking at this as a scheme every 12 months. Will it happen next year? Will it be rolled forward? Frankly, we think that this is something that needs to be pretty much a permanent service. Not just in Tameside, but across the whole of Greater Manchester. And we need to build that in, I think, to our budgets, basically. We should be budgeting for this as a permanent service into core budgets, instead of relying every year on whether we can or can't, find the money to resource it. It is something that we need for that vulnerable section of our community, and I do think that I'd like to see whether we can build something in as a more permanent feature for the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Brenda, and just to echo, thanks, Paul, for all the work you've done on A Bed Every Night as our portfolio lead. Brenda, there is some tremendous work going on in Tameside. It really is impressive. Obviously, we all know of the famous Pauline Town and everything she does, but there are so many people working to support people. And you're right, there's an infrastructure around Bed Every Night, and it's only with that other infrastructure that this even works at all. I should thank you. I should have thanked you earlier, actually, as co-chair of the Joint Commissioning Board for the funding which has been provided via that board and our health service colleagues to support A Bed Every Night. There's also been funding directly from the Greater Manchester Health and Care Partnership itself. We've got to thank our Police and Crime Commissioner, Baroness Beverly Hughes for putting funding forward, and also the Prisons and Probation Service, who've also helped us with the funding package alongside the Greater Manchester Mayor's charity. So all of those partners have helped us do this. So I think that funding package illustrates, as Brenda was saying, this isn't necessarily this isn't statutory funding. This is funding that we're finding to do this. And I say this to the government, we're coming forward with what we can do. We need to see you coming forward with what you're going to do to make a success of this everyone in policy. We want to create a partnership on it, but it does require you to step forward and fully fund the noble intentions behind the everyone in policy. So thank you, colleagues. I'm hoping you can see all of the recommendations are set out. We're agreeing expenditure allocations to the districts of £4.75 million funded in the way I just described. Any amendments would be delegated to the Treasurer in consultation with the portfolio lead. I'm hoping when we pass these recommendations just now, we are all doing it in memory of Sue Murphy, our great friend. Colleagues, are they agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Item 14, Greater Manchester's Adult Education Plan for the academic year. Can I ask Councillor Sean Fielding to present the paper? John.
Just unmuting. Thanks, Chair. So this paper sets out the proposed approach for the management and administration of the devolved education budget for the 2020-21 academic year. Within it is the outline of the proposed provider allocations for the academic year, and these allocations have been calculated in line with the principles and process for future years as previously agreed by the combined authority. The devolved adult education budget is a real success story. Prior to devolution, the budget was supporting 65 to 70,000 residents each year, but our ambition under the devolved arrangements is to support 75,500 residents by the end of the first devolved academic year. When the funding was devolved, we took the opportunity to depart from a national one-size-fits-all approach to adult education and use local planning and management to tailor adult education to the needs of the city region. This doesn't involve sweeping changes in the early years, but does give us a chance to develop an evidence base and inform future policy changes, and also develop really strong relationships with local providers. Prior to devolution, there were more than 300 providers operating in Greater Manchester, with more than 75% of these based outside of the conurbation. Around 20% of these delivered education provision to just one person. The number of organisations delivering adult education to Greater Manchester residents is now significantly reduced, which means that the combined authority is able to take a strategic view and focus on contracts and relationships with providers. And now, no single contract for a lead contract provider or supply chain provider delivers provision to fewer than 10 Greater Manchester residents. Whilst we didn't make sweeping changes to adult education in Greater Manchester when the budget was devolved, members will recall that changes that we did make included the following: free education and training for all residents without a first full level 2 qualification, and previously these courses were only part funded for employed learners aged over 24. We introduced free learning for employed residents earning below the national living wage, when previously this was only available to those earning below the national minimum wage. We funded units of advanced learning at level 3, and prior to devolution, all level 3 learning was loan funded by the individual. We provided free British Sign Language for those whose first language is British Sign Language, which brings British Sign Language qualifications into line with comparable entitlements for English. And we've ensured that all providers are rated either good or outstanding by Ofsted. Prior to devolution, there was no control over the quality of providers. For the 2020-21 academic year, whilst we'll be working to ensure stability in the market, there are some additional high-level objectives that have been added. And the one that I think will be of most interest is the commitment to use the adult education budget as part of the recovery package in response to the coronavirus pandemic. In the short term, this will have a particular focus on supporting key workers and essential services, and in the medium to long term, we'll work to harness the potential of temporary volunteers by developing packages of learning that support them onto training pathways that lead to key worker occupations and priority sectors. It will also be used to upskill and retrain individuals who have been furloughed or made redundant due to the outbreak. The confirmed devolved adult education budget for the academic year 2020-21 is £96.2 million, which is an increase of more than £3.5 million on the previous year. The proposed allocations of the budget are set out in Appendix 2 of the report, and the recommendations that I'm seeking your agreement for today are set out on page 3. I'm happy to take any questions or comments, Chair.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'm going to bring Baroness Beverly Hughes in, but it's clear to me that there are already fantastic changes coming through as a result of adult education devolution in Greater Manchester, and that's down to you. So thanks very much for the work you've done on this. But I'll bring Bev in now. Bev.
Thank you, Andy. Well, first of all, just to reinforce what you've just said, I think it's absolutely fantastic to see the progress that we've made since devolution in making the adult education budget fit much more closely to the needs of our citizens across the board in Greater Manchester. And I just want to congratulate Sean and people he's been working with for doing that. Secondly, also to endorse what he said about the really heightened importance of all of this post-COVID, because there will be even more people needing the support of entry into adult education, obviously as a result of what's happened to many of them. And so seeing this as an important element in our overall recovery programme is really important. The point I specifically wanted to make from my point of view is that, as you know, when the government announced its about turn on the arrangements for probation and said it was going back to an integrated probation service, bringing together the former probation service and the community rehabilitation companies, which Chris Grayling had hived off into the private sector, when they made that about turn, we argued successfully not to be part of a Northwest Regional Integrated Probation Service, but to have our own Greater Manchester Probation Service. And we now have a director for that Greater Manchester Probation Service, a director designate, Chris Edwards. And I just wanted to make the point that many of the priority cohorts that Sean's identified in this report that will be one of the foci of the budget, that is offenders, marginalised and vulnerable women, people who've suffered seriously in mental health or drug and alcohol addiction, they will also be the focus of the commissioning which the new Greater Manchester Probation Service will make for services to support those groups back into employment and training. And so it was really just to say there's an enormous opportunity to make sure that we get more than the sum of the parts, if you like, by aligning what the probation service will be commissioning for those groups, along with what we want to commission through the adult education budget. I'm meeting Chris Edwards next week actually to talk about his commissioning framework, and I'll raise this with him. But I think if officers at respective levels can start to talk to each other, I think that would be really positive. Thanks.
Thanks, but I'll bring Sean back in to answer that. Sean.
Thanks, and thanks to Baroness Hughes for raising that point. I can confirm that we are working with the probation service, and our team will be working closely with those within the CA that now have the relationship with the probation service to ensure that those services that are commissioned by the new Greater Manchester Probation Services and ours within the adult education budget are aligned as best they can. And I think that just gives me another opportunity to highlight how the devolution of this budget allows us to bring things together much more closely so that they make more sense, they drive efficiencies and just better outcomes generally for our city region, and particularly for some of our more vulnerable residents that when it was commissioned nationally, it just wasn't possible to do as effectively as we can now. So yeah, absolutely, we'll work really closely with the probation service or any partner for that matter where our interests are aligned so that we can really support the residents of Greater Manchester.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks very much, Sean. So, colleagues, you've heard from Sean that there's a package here that is doing everything to support our residents, but also our providers in this challenging climate. And I think the progress that we are making on our adult education is we've already achieved more than was achieved for decades on adult education in just a couple of years. So we're being asked to approve the proposed approach for the management and administration of the budget and the allocations as set out, and obviously the request for delegated authority for in-year changes. So, colleagues, can I ask that those recommendations be approved?
Great.
Great.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to item 15, Economic Resilience Dashboard, which I suspect might now have to become a standing item on our CA agenda, given the challenges that are out there for our businesses across the city region and the difficulties they're going to face. We need to be vigilant in terms of supporting them, but I have absolutely great confidence that our new portfolio lead for economy and business will be doing exactly that. So to introduce the dashboard, I will bring in Councillor Elise Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. It is a big challenge, and you've bigged me up, so no pressure there. Obviously, this report is an update on the Greater Manchester economy as it currently is. It is not something that's necessarily new. You may have noticed that it resembled very much the Brexit Monitor, which was similar information that we were monitoring regularly, and we've evolved that to help us understand what's going on through this current crisis that we've got now. And it will come as no surprise that basically it shows that the Greater Manchester economy has experienced an unprecedented shock. That's probably similar and very similar to everywhere else in the country and potentially globally. Though one of the things that really stood out for me, and I really wanted to pull out of that report, was the impact on the claimants, so out of work claimants and the claims for universal credit. I think that is particularly stark and something I just did want to highlight. I think it's also worth bearing in mind with that that the furlough scheme is mitigating the number of people that are having to make that claim. So whilst the furlough scheme is in place currently, we're not seeing as many people apply for universal credit as we may have done if that scheme hadn't existed. And I think the recent surveys as well that have been undertaken by both the Growth Company and the Chamber of Commerce locally has shown that every business that's responded to those surveys is being affected by the current crisis. But I think so we need to think, well, what's been our response? And I suppose the first thing to touch on is the immense amount of work that the local authorities across Greater Manchester have done in getting the business rate support out, those grants out to those businesses that needed them. And I think across Greater Manchester, we're looking at £450 million having been now paid out to businesses by local authorities. And of course, subsequent to lobbying of government did then announce that the uplift with a discretionary scheme so that we can support those businesses that weren't eligible in that first round of funding. And I know that much work again is being done by the local authorities across the city region to get that money out to those businesses that have been waiting. I think it's worth also making a note of the initial Greater Manchester Loan Fund of £3 million that's been provided to support cash flows of firms that are struggling because they fell between the gaps of the government response to that. And in addition to that, the immense amount of work in supporting and advising businesses that the Growth Company is doing and information through the Growth Hub, as well as all those local authorities, all the councils and the work that they're doing in their areas as well, has been actually really significant. And I think it's really a testament to how we work in Greater Manchester, that all of those organisations in all of the areas that we represent really pulling together to support each other. And we know that there are business groups, trade unions, the Combined Authority, TFGM, working closely to really help businesses as we look to move into this next phase of reopening and starting again, and how we do that safely. And ensuring that people feel safe and feel confident. And I think, you know, Andy, you referred to that earlier about the importance that people feel safe about being able to go back to work and continue with their lives. And I think the government response has been actually significant, and I think that's worth recognising as well, and also, and obviously incredibly welcomed. You know, the things that they have been able to put in place has made such a difference to those who were eligible for the support that's been made. I think there have been gaps, and obviously, like I said earlier, we have been quite successful at being able to fill in where those gaps have been. I'd say there's significant concerns around what's going to happen as the furlough scheme draws to an end, and what impact that's going to have on businesses. I think it is particularly stark to maybe for the nighttime economy, and how they're going to function, as they were one of the first sectors to close down or to go into lockdown, and then will be one of the last sectors possibly to come out of lockdown, and their ability to then get back up and running whilst you know enforcing social distancing guidelines will impact on what they're able to do. So I think it'll be really important to see how the government's going to address that, and what support we can put in place locally to support that. And I think, again, as that furlough scheme ends, the impact on those claiming universal credit could be quite significant. So, you know, I think that's something else to watch. Now, when we're considering locally, what we've done locally, I think what we've shown is here our ability to be dynamic and ambitious in Greater Manchester. So we know that we've launched, along with the Greater Manchester LEP, the Local Enterprise Partnership, Build Back Better, and we do see ourselves as really forward-looking as to what the future is going to hold, and how we can build that the greener you know, more inclusive opportunities that this crisis maybe has created for us to look at. And I think when we're so in terms of like the green economy, working towards our target of carbon neutrality by 2038, there's a real opportunity there, and Councillor Weston spoke quite eloquently on what we can do potentially to tackle that. And I think it's also worth, though, like I said, saying that that furlough, what happens to the nighttime economy, how they and specific other sectors who might have been experiencing difficulties specific to their sector. And I think how we can really look to tackle those on lower incomes and insecure work. There's a real opportunity when we're seeking to build back better to really think about how we could address that. And I'm thinking specifically around, say, the care sector and in social care. We know that there's work there that could be done, and we've already got in place our good employment charter, and maybe that being an opportunity to build on that, and to kind of embed that within our Build Back Better, to make it the best we can do. I think so altogether, I'm saying in Greater Manchester, we are ambitious. We want to make sure that it is right for the people of Greater Manchester, and that we see that recovery, and that recovery is felt across all our sectors, and that people feel that we are recovering from this crisis. And I think what we can see, and what we've clearly demonstrated through things like our adult education budget, is that when it is locally led, when we are devolved and empowered to make those changes, that we can do that, we can react fast, that we can be dynamic, that we are agile, and that we can be ambitious and deliver on those ambitions. So, you know, all that work that we've got around the local industrial strategy to deliver on that clean growth, the health innovation, the advanced materials, and our digital sector is going to be really, really key. I think I'll leave it there, Andy, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Elise, and thank you for all the work that's going on. There's a huge amount of work to support people, and some of the loans that our council have got out, and indeed the CA has got out, have been crucial in supporting our businesses, but we're obviously going to need to continue to do that. I just want to pick up the point you made about the furlough scheme. Obviously there's changes being announced today with regard to businesses making a part contribution from August. Sasha Lord, our nighttime economy advisor, is warning today that won't be possible for many in the hospitality sector, and I'm glad to be able to amplify his comments today, because as you said, they just, with all of the pressures they're facing, they are going to really struggle, and actually it undermines the whole point of introducing a furlough scheme if you're going to withdraw it too soon and then let businesses go bust. What was the point, if you're not going to help them see this through. So thanks very much, Elise. I can't see any questions coming through, but as I say, this will probably be a standing item that we will be coming back to every month. So thank you very much indeed for your update. Now going to lower the mood even further and take us on to item 16, which is a financial update. This is our first go at facing up to the scale of what lies ahead of all of you as individual districts and ourselves as a CA, Greater Manchester collectively, of course, with the pressures on TFGM as well. I was going to bring in David Molyneux, our portfolio lead, to speak on this, but I think he's having trouble with his microphone. That makes him sound like Norman Collier, which is a little unfair, but I don't think David is able to present the paper to us. So Steve Wilson, our treasurer, will do that in a moment. Obviously, as you look at what's in the paper, there are huge unresolved issues here, and I don't think we can do justice to them today, full justice to them today, given the scale of what is facing you as individual districts and all of us collectively as Greater Manchester. The outlook is dire, and there needs to be a substantial response from government to the position that local authorities find themselves in, particularly recognising that the virus has hit our most deprived communities hardest, and yet the funding arrangements haven't fully recognised that to this point. So before I bring in Steve, I just want to put to the CA that, given the enormity of these issues, I am going to propose that we hold a special CA on local authority and CA finance on the 24th of June, Wednesday the 24th of June, to begin to provide the evidence of what is happening here, both in terms of the costs you've incurred, but of course the lost income as well, and all of the other financial knock-on implications for us as a city region. And I think it would be right to have that moment where we focus on the enormity of this challenge. So I put that thought out there for you all, colleagues. But I think the best way to make progress is to ask Steve to introduce the paper. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much. The paper is presented for members to note the estimated impact of COVID at this stage. There's a couple of specific recommendations that I'll draw your attention to. The use of £1 million of TFGM reserves to cover the residual shortfall on Metrolink in 2019-20. To delegate to myself and TFGM Finance Director work to enable a cap to revenue switch to fund some of the GMIP development funding that was going to be picked up through business rates to relieve the pressure on business rates. And to note some of the work we're doing around the next stage, and we'll bring lots more of that information back in the June session once that's set up. So I won't go through the details of the paper line by line, just draw out a couple of things. First thing to note that this is a moving picture. These are a first set of estimates. Local authorities, as you will all know, are now submitting monthly returns to MHCLG on their costs. So these are based on the May estimates. But we already know that there's a couple of things have changed since these returns were done and since this paper was constructed, which the Mayor mentioned in his opening words, which was around the light rail funding settlement for Metrolink. So I will provide a bit of an update on that in a minute. And it's also important to know that there are a number of assumptions being made around the remaining part of 2020-21, particularly around the nature of recovery, the timing of recovery, and how that feeds through into both income and expenditure. So huge caveats that go with these numbers, but what the analysis shows very clearly is that there is a significant cost pressure to all of the Greater Manchester local authorities, and in addition the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and in particular TFGM. So on these numbers, even with the funding that came out in 2 tranches from government, which totals 168 million for the 10 authorities, there's still a gap of 406 million estimated for the final part of 2019-20 and the whole of 2020-21. And actually, we've only addressed that short-term impact to the end of 2021 in this paper, but obviously some of these areas are things that will not recover beyond that period. So again, as we further develop the analysis, we'll look at a longer time period around recovery on a number of these issues. So just to pick up in particular the Metrolink update that was mentioned earlier. So there's quite a bit of detail around Metrolink in the paper. It is a moving picture. When we wrote the paper, the initial tranche of funding had been announced from the Department of Transport, which was 11.6 million, which was to the period the 8th of June. There has been further work and a further announcement very recently, which takes us through, as the Mayor said, to a period up to the 4th of August, which provides an extra £13.3 million of funding, so 24.9 million in total. What that means up to that period is a minimum shortfall of around about 1.4 million for the period up to August. It's a minimum because there is still work to do in confirming the precise terms of the settlement, particularly around funding for some of the costs that that TFGM and Metrolink faces. And on top of that, we don't know yet what happens beyond that 4th of August period. So the social distancing requirements will mean that Metrolink revenues remain significantly suppressed for the rest of that financial year. So there will be an ongoing operational cost of that of around about of up to 23 million for the remaining part of the year. If that is funded, then that means that there will be a residual cost of around about 7 million for the remaining part of the year. So whilst we are pleased to have got some positive response on that funding, there is more work to do around the Metrolink settlement. Finally, just wanted to pick up on next steps and recovery, but happy to pick up any details on the specific items within the report. And again, we'll bring more information back to the June meeting, but we are working very hard with district treasurers to make sure that we continue to keep an accurate record of the costs, continue to report in this way to yourselves, and enable us to make evidence-based statements around the cost of COVID-19 to Greater Manchester as a whole. And we're looking at ways that we can work together to minimise those impact and support recovery. So there's a couple of areas that we've referenced within the paper where we're already looking at a different approach. So the specific recommendation around the funding for GMIP, if you recall, there was a potential ask on business rates in 2020-21 of circa 10 million to develop that. because we know the pressure business rates are now coming under, we've looked at an alternative route to funding that, and that is to use the Transforming Cities 2 fund and to facilitate a capital revenue switch to pick up what we hope is all of the costs of the GMAP infrastructure development programme in 2020-21, and avoiding the need to come back to business rates for an ask this financial year. So that's an example. There are other areas that we're working closely with Treasury on that we'll bring back in June, where we can work together to mitigate some of the immediate impacts that we're facing. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Steve. I've got Mayor Dennett.
Thank you, Mayor Burnham. It's more of a comment, really. Obviously, I welcome the report, and I welcome that we're going to have a special meeting of the Combined Authority on the 24th of June to really consider this in detail. For me, local government financing has to be part of our Build Back Better work moving forward, because colleagues will know we've seen 10 years of austerity, which was a precursor to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's seen decimation in local government of our budgets and inevitably the services we provide within our respective communities. And when we look at the funding that government's made available between tranche 1 and tranche 2, you know, I'm acutely aware that we saw a £11.89 million reduction between tranche 1 and tranche 2 in Greater Manchester, and as has already been highlighted, we're forecasting significant deficits both at a combined authority level and also at a local authority level. So for me, you know, we have to be thinking about, well, what is progressive local government financing for the future? Because certainly what we've seen to date is a rowing back of settlement funding from central government and an engagement, if you like, with regressive forms of taxation in the form of council tax and precept hikes. And what worries me about that kind of approach to financing local government, and also, you know, the combined authority services that we provide, is it disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable within our communities and within our neighbourhoods. And, you know, to be quite frank, I don't think we can continue with this approach. And, you know, as part of our Build Back Better work, you know, local government financing and a progressive approach to this needs to be at the heart of that. Obviously, we know the fair funding review has been deferred for the time being for, it looks like, another year. We've not had the green paper on social care, and obviously I'd like to see significant improvements in terms of care workers' pay within Greater Manchester. But I'm just making a plea, really, that moving forward, local government financing will be at the heart of all of our Build Back Better work. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Paul. I've got Andrew, Elise and Brenda. So Andrew first.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, it's just to and obviously the substantive meeting that we have on this in due course is somewhere where I'll pick this up more fully, but just to provide some context for residents and anybody watching the meeting, because I often think that the calls around local government finance don't resonate in quite the same way as they have done in some other areas. But just to give an illustration of what Trafford's looking at after use of reserves and after the government has provided us with the support that they have today, we're looking at, and I know some colleagues are looking at significantly more than this within GM, a £24.5 million funding gap. And just by way of an example, if we were to close all of our libraries, which obviously is not something that we would ever want to do, that would only save £1 million. If we were to get to a point where we were to make 10% of our workforce redundant, that would save us around £7 million. These are pretty extreme measures, you know, and I think it's really important when we talk about these sorts of issues that people understand the scale of what we're dealing with here, because we were told that we would be fully funded and we absolutely have not been. But it's important to recognise that we have had 10 years of austerity, and I echo the points around you know, the future sustainability of funding made by Mayor Dennett, but actually it's just to illustrate some examples really about how we would begin to get to that 24.5 million if we don't receive further support. It's really scary. We're not talking one last heave around you know, cuts that could be made. We are talking about a devastating impact on each and every one of the councils in GM and indeed around the country. So it's a message to residents to get angry about this, really, and also to government to deal with this and deal with it urgently. And that's it. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andrew. Elise.
Thanks, Andy. I like 406 million. I'm just going to say that again, like 406 million. Like the numbers are astronomical. They are huge figures, and I couldn't agree more with what Andrew Weston's just said. In Stockport, it was £25 million gap. That's masses, and I think we need to be really clear with government about actually what that means, as well as ensuring that residents, people understand what it's going to mean if we don't have that money. I noticed today Councillor James Jameson, the chair of the Conservative chair of the Local Government Association, has called for more funding for local government, and I think one of the figures he was quoting was £6 billion. And I think it's not just us. There was a sort of a report again today saying 75% of councils across the country are asking and calling for additional funding because they're in dire straits, and they need that to ensure that services that are valued by residents, by people today, right now, continue. And like Councillor Weston said, we're talking about the things like the libraries and services about for our vulnerable people and those who need our additional support, really being put under pressure, and a real question mark on what we're going to be able to do in the future. And what, you know, what's going to be remaining at the end of all of this. So I think that's really important that we understand that. And then going back to what I said before around recovery, you know, what we've been able to demonstrate in Greater Manchester is our real agility to reacting to stuff, but also our ambition. We have big ambitions in Greater Manchester. We've shown that, we've demonstrated it with the adult education budget. If no other, we can just use that as one example of how at a local level what we can do to really drive the change and make a difference to people's lives. And I know, for example, in Stockport, our Mayoral Development Corporation and our vision for our town centre is a real catalyst and can really turn things around for people, not just in terms of finding places to live, but also regenerate our economy and get it back up and running. And there's real potential here, but it does require the government to really take seriously local government, to really engage with us and really want to work in partnership with us and recognise the importance that of what we do, and understand the impact we can have, because we deliver, local government delivers, and I think that's really key. And I know that the Secretary of State has made some comments recently about really wanting to engage with us more, and I really welcome that. Like, absolutely come and find out about what we're doing and the difference we can make, because we need them now to really understand and really step up to the plate. And I absolutely echo Mayor Dennett's comments about really welcoming an opportunity to have a special meeting to really discuss what local government finance is like. So thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Elise. Brenda?
Thank you, Andy. First of all, can I absolutely echo all of the points that have just been made by Elise. Absolutely fundamental to everything that we do, and certainly by Paul and by Andy. Fully endorse everything that has been said, so I won't look to rehearse it all again, but we do definitely deliver, as Elise has just said, and we do need the government to recognise that and support us. But the 2 points I just wanted to raise questions on, and I'm more than happy just to, if you like, log these questions and pick them up at the special meeting. The first one is on the fire service. Just noting that what has been received and the costs, that they're actually in front. So there would be something of a surplus there. And I just wondered, because it doesn't say it in the report, how that surplus might be distributed, if at all. So that's one point. And the other is on waste, actually. And again, a very simple point, but we know that through this period up until recently, all of our refuse tips were closed, for use, although most of us carried on, sort of making sure that there were collections locally. Now, so there's going to have been an increase in the local collections for obvious reasons, but very definitely there will not have been the costs incurred by people using the facilities that were closed. So again, there's no mention of that as far as I can see, and the budget doesn't sort of add up. It doesn't mention it. Really, it would be useful for us to know just what the situation is with the waste service there in terms of the overall budgets of what has been incurred and what hasn't been incurred, and how that balances out. So I'm happy for those to be picked up in a special meeting, if that's okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Brenda. Important questions, those, but we will do that. I've now got Eamon O'Brien, David Greenhalgh, Alan Brett and Sean Fielding. So I'll take you in turn if that's okay. Eamon.
Thanks, Andy. I'll do the same as Brenda and just say I do agree with the comments that have been made, and rather than rehearse them, just highlight an area that perhaps is worthwhile starting to think about when we discuss the finances, which is the fact that throughout all of this crisis, it's been local government and in many respects devolved and regional assemblies that have done the work on the ground to fix the gaps in the centralised government provision, whether that's been on food provision and distribution, PPE testing, business support. Being on the front line and actually building the relationships with people is far more important than just centrally allocating resources and putting up targets, which have been shown time and time again to be missed. And so I think what's actually come out of this is not just that need to fund us properly, because the recovery will fail if local government shuts down, which is what's going to happen if we have to find £400 million. A lot of things we want to do, all the positive stuff that Elise talked about and others have mentioned, will be really difficult to do. So we need to move beyond, I think, that focus as well, and say this is an opportunity to maybe push for even more devolution and look at some of those opportunities around what we can do more effectively. We're going to have massive issues around getting people back to work. We're going to have massive issues around universal credit, many people using it for the first time, issues around people falling into rent arrears. So there's going to be a huge amount of focus on how we actually get people back into work, support businesses to keep going, and stop people falling into the poverty trap. And this might be an opportunity where we can actually say, devolution, it's been ignored really for the last few years. That other national issues have took over, and I think we all know why that was. But this is a great opportunity as well to not just make the case for funding, but also a change in the relationship with central government. And so whilst that's a big issue and probably will take a lot of time to develop, it's probably worthwhile tying it in with the funding issue, because if we all get in the weeds on financing, we'll miss that bigger opportunity potentially.
Absolutely. Thanks very much indeed, Eamon. David Greenhalgh, then Alan Brett. I think you're muted, David.
So apologies for that. It was all geared up as well. Yeah, so I'm going to save the bulk of my comments to the larger, more detailed meeting. But I just want to make a few initial comments. And first of all, I think it's important I say that I will absolutely join the rest of you in lobbying for that extra money. So I think that's the first given. I think we have to acknowledge, and I'm really delighted that other colleagues today have acknowledged and welcomed the amount of support already that we have received from government. It's also reference been made this morning of the announcement from the LGA, from the Conservative led chair of the LGA, joint cross-party organisation, highlighting this, recognising the need for more money for local government. We all know we've been disproportionately hit, and therefore I'm absolutely committed to lobbying for you and doing all I can with us, joining in that to get us more funds. But I do think we have to do that in the context of recognising the unprecedented level of support that the government has already given. I realise we live in unprecedented times, but I think it is worth us absolutely acknowledging that. And also, we've seen report after report in just this meeting today, where we will be going back to government on more individual issues that were going for us before COVID started, on buses, on clean air. We're out there with our hands outstretched again for all those areas as well. So I think there is a bit of work for us to do as we come out of this, and I don't know if this will be discussed in this larger meeting. There is a larger piece of work for us that while all these issues for us are key, there may be a degree of us to prioritise moving forward in what is we see as our priorities. Because at the moment we are asking for more. We're like Oliver with the begging bowl, aren't we? We want more, so we want more. And we do want more, and we must absolutely make sure we do get more. But when we get that, we get those finances, we will be, there's no doubt we will be paying this off for generations to come. Generations, the level of support that we have had, and we mustn't underestimate that. I will absolutely join the rest of you in lobbying for more for our local government. That's what I'm absolutely committed to our services, to the quality of those services, to the quality of those frontline services. But I do want a reality check, please, on the support we've currently got and the promise of more moving forward. That's all I ask. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And I'm sure we can build some of that into the paper that comes to the meeting on the 24th. Alan Brett.
Can I just raise a couple of things like that, because otherwise we'll be discussing what we are having a special meeting for. First of all, I think, like everybody, this 400 odd million is after not just the government grants, but the fact that we've all of us have used part of our reserves, and you can only use them once. Secondly, David Green is right. Yes, we are asking for more, but the problem is that local government finance is biased away from metropolitan authorities, and unless we get the whole local government finance picture fixed, then we will always be handing out a begging bowl, and that is the problem. Local government finance.
Thanks very much, Alan. Sean Fielding.
Thanks, Chair. I can't promise not to repeat what other people have said because it's very difficult, but I think what's come out in all of this is a complete lack of understanding on the part of the government about the way local government finance has been forced to work over recent years because of austerity. There was a call with the minister, which I wasn't present on, but it was reported back to me that they were expressing surprise at how dependent many local authorities have become on income. And the response that many, particularly metropolitan northern Labour authorities gave was, well, are you really surprised when you've cut us so much? We've had to put up charges and we've had to find other sources of income from other areas to support our financial position. And at the moment, we were given that pledge to spend what we needed to in order to respond to the coronavirus crisis. But actually, it's not just spending that is putting us in a difficult financial position. It's the loss of income. It's the loss of whether it's rents, whether it's parking charges, whether it's planning fees, whatever it is. there's plenty of money that is normally coming into the coffers of local authorities that is no longer coming in because the economy has slowed, and of course nobody's coming into our town centres, so they're not buying parking tickets or whatever it might be. So we're losing a significant amount of income that supports the finances of councils. Now, we were already looking at a budget gap of in excess of 20 million in Oldham before coronavirus even hit. That's having taken more than 200 million out over the past 10 years, which represents about 50% of our revenue budget. Now, on top of that, we're now looking at a gap when you look at loss of income and also combined additional expenditure of £46.2 million in Oldham. That is absolutely enormous. We've seen these graphs of doom in the past that we've managed to avoid for so long, but I don't think that that's going to be possible when we're facing such unprecedented financial pressure. And I know we'll cover this in much more detail at the end of June. But we're already hearing, and we've heard a bit of it on this call today, that the government will need to cut back and repay some of the funding that it has released to support the recovery effort during this period. Well, that's exactly what they did back in 2010, post the 2008 financial crisis. And what that did was held down wages, held down demand in the economy, sent us into a double-dip recession in 2012, and just meant that we've not fully recovered from the financial crisis in 2008 as of today. And if the government were to take that approach once again and cut back even further on top of what they've already done to try and respond to this, it would be a mistake. It would have the same effect and probably a much worse effect than it did 10 years ago. Now, we've got really ambitious plans in Oldham, as I know that many other local authorities around the city region have, to invest in our place, to really shape the kind of borough that we want to have, to create jobs, to create new infrastructure, and to move our boroughs on, particularly in the northeast sector where we have not had the kind of investment that we really need and really want. And we do not want to have to dial down those ambitions, because if we have to dial down those ambitions as a result of the government making further cuts to our local authorities, then the recovery will be slower and more painful than it needs to be. And it comes at a significant cost, not just to the balance sheets of the government or to the council, but to the lives and livelihoods of people in Oldham and people in Greater Manchester. So this is a plea now, and I'll make it again at the end of June. We cannot afford to have the government take the approach of setting even deeper cuts on local authorities to try and balance the books, as it described it last time, because in effect it does exactly the opposite.
Thanks very much indeed, Sean, and everybody actually for your powerful contributions. And I think, oops, if you can all hear me. Thanks, Sean. Thanks everybody for your powerful contributions. And I think what they show is the very much we need this meeting on the 24th of June, because there's so much to unpack. And as I said at the start, we can't do it all here. Shame that David Molyneux couldn't contribute, but he has put in the chat how local government, local authorities and the combined authority are going to be critical to successful recovery in terms of our economy and wider society. And so, you know, that has to be understood when it comes to a funding package for us. So we will take on board points raised. Brenda, you mentioned the fire service surplus, waste costs. Eamon made the point about more devolution. If you're okay, let's pick all of those issues. We've heard the concerns, and we'll pick those issues up in the wider meeting on the 24th. So thank you for raising those. But I'm taking it, colleagues, that everyone would want that meeting, which in itself will signal to the government how urgent these issues are for us all. I'm taking that as assent, if that's okay.
Yes, that's agreed, Andy. Thanks.
Thanks, Brenda. And I'm going to move on then to item 17, which should be more straightforward and hopefully to the point. But in David's absence, Steve, would you mind just speaking briefly to this one again, please?
Yeah, sure. So this is the Combined Authority Treasury Management Strategy. It's been through the Audit Committee, has been approved by the Audit Committee, so it's coming on to the CA for approval along with the associated documents. Obviously, it would have come here earlier before the start of the year, but we're bringing it as early as we could following the COVID issues. So here for approval. Nothing to add really, but I can try and answer any questions if anyone's got any.
Can't see anyone indicating, Steve, so as you say, it is a fairly routine piece of business. So colleagues, can I ask that that be approved? I'm taking silence as agreed. Thank you. You got there in the end. Thanks very much, colleagues. We've got items 18 and 19 on GM housing investment. So I will ask Paul to take these together. And I'm assuming that there are no issues that colleagues want to raise in Part B. And if I'm correct in that, we'll take all of it under items 18 and 19. So if I may, Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mayor Burnham. I'll try and be quick, but I am cognizant we've obviously not brought housing investment loans funds to the combined authority because obviously we've not been meeting for a while. So the combined authority is obviously asked to approve the housing investment loans, but there's also some equity investments in the paper that you've probably noted that we're also being asked to approve. The CA is also asked to note the report which refers to 2 loans that were approved under emergency powers by the Chief Executive of the Combined Authority in consultation with myself. So I'll move on to the loans. So the first loans is to Mayor Property Developments Limited. It's Riley's Snooker Centre in Altrincham in Trafford, and it's for £1.99 million. It's for 8 homes. Planning permission was granted back in December 2019. We are supporting a small medium enterprise in Greater Manchester with this, and there's an infrastructure levy payment of £123,000. That isn't referenced in the report, but I'm just making colleagues aware of that. The second loan arrangement is to the Sheridan Group, and this is with regards to Diamond Hall Woodhouses. It's in Oldham, 1.967 million, 8 houses. Planning permission was granted in January of this year. Again, supporting an SME developer, and there is a Section 106 contribution with this of £160,000 as well. And then to move on probably to some interesting developments with the Housing Investment Loans Fund are the equity investments proposed in the paper. The first one is to Residents Limited. Residents is a social impact fund. And this is a GM-wide initiative looking at investing £5 million into a limited partnership fund to acquire, modify and refurbish properties across Greater Manchester, and they will be leased by registered providers as part of our ethical lettings agency. And I think this dovetails nicely with what we were talking about earlier in terms of phase 3 of Bed Every Night. Homes will be provided to those on our housing waiting list across our districts, and people who rely on housing benefit obviously will be key beneficiaries of this initiative. And as colleagues know, we've nearly got up to 100,000 households on our housing waiting list, and obviously we're struggling with the homelessness and housing crisis as well at the moment. So a really good development there. The proposal is for £5 million of equity investment, and then the next equity investment is again to Residents Limited, but this is their Learning Disabilities Fund. Again, we're going to take a GM-wide approach to this. £5 million worth of investment is being proposed, and again it's to acquire, modify and refurbish properties across Greater Manchester to be leased to housing providers, and the accommodation will benefit residents with learning and physical disabilities, and people with autism, people with sensory impairments, mental health, and again it's linked to those who are reliant as well on housing benefit payments. So some really interesting developments that I think start to demonstrate a real operationalisation of our housing strategy and how we're using the Housing Investment Loans Fund to target some of those areas where we've got significant challenges within Greater Manchester. And just for noting, the loans that were approved in April 2020, that's Health Farm Lane LLP, which is in Trafford, £5 million worth of investment there, and Specialist Care Developments Limited Oldham, that's £981,000. Colleagues are also being asked to delegate authority to the Treasurer in conjunction with the monitoring officer and prepare and effect the necessary legal arrangements with regards to the Housing Investment Loans Fund proposals. So if everyone's happy to accept those recommendations, they're before you this afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Paul. Some really interesting schemes there, particularly the scheme supporting people with learning and physical disabilities and autism, and of course the other scheme to support Bed Every Night. So fantastic work. Thank you very much. I can see Councillor Fielding would like to speak in relation to item 19. So, Sean, if I could hand the floor to you.
Thanks, Chair. It's kind of a ward issue, but I hope that the CA will just indulge me, because I can't let this report go through without comment, because the development at Diamond Hall in Woodhouses has been quite contentious locally and has been the subject of numerous resident enquiries to local members with regard to issues around social distancing on site and other working practices. These, of course, remain the responsibility of the local authority to deal with, and of course, Oldham Council is doing that. It's fair to say that eyebrows were raised locally, however, when less than 7 months after being elected on a pledge to oppose house building in Woodhouses Village, one of our local independents took a donation towards a defibrillator project from Sheridan Group, who's the developer on this site. This conversion to supporting the executive house building in the village was almost a quicker political volte-face than Nick Clegg's on the issue of tuition fees. However, of course, the development did receive planning permission, as there was no valid reason to refuse it, and the homes do contribute toward Oldham's housing requirement, and so there's no legitimate reason to object to the loan that the report proposes. I support the recommendations in the report, but just couldn't let it pass through without placing my concerns and observations on record.
I think you've certainly done that, Sean, so thank you. Any other colleagues want to come in on any of these items? If not, we're being asked to approve the strategy to increase the investment capacity of the GM Housing Investment Loans Fund, delegating authority to the GM Treasurer where appropriate, and then in relation to the specific schemes that Paul has outlined, approving the Trafford and Oldham schemes, the investments in Resonance Limited, and the further schemes in Heath Farm Trafford and Stevenson Street Oldham. Colleagues, are those agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much, and you'll be pleased to hear we turn to our final item, Greater Manchester Bounce Back Loans. I think Steve was going to say something about this, and then Elise. I'll go to Steve first.
Thank you. Obviously this has been brought forward as an urgent piece of business. The paper sets out a proposed bounce back loan scheme for Greater Manchester, and we're looking for CA approval in principle for that. The paper further seeks that we approve an amendment to the GMCA capital programme of £10 million to cover the capital going into that scheme, and that the CA approves the operation of the scheme via the Manchester Growth Company. Important thing to note, this is obviously part of the government scheme. It is 100% guaranteed by government, so there is no capital being placed at risk by GM authorities or by the GMCA, and obviously it will be a vital part of ensuring that those that can't currently access the national scheme through traditional banks are able to access the scheme within Greater Manchester.
Thanks, Steve. I should acknowledge that Richard and Paul Dennett, Richard Lees and Paul Dennett, have declared an interest on this item, and I think have left the meeting. So thank you to them for that, and I will now bring in Elise.
Thanks, Andy. This, I think, is a really excellent example of how what I was talking about earlier around how we can plug gaps where there's been gaps in what the government have been in their offer in this time of crisis. And we know that some businesses have struggled accessing the bounce back loans, and this is basically us creating the opportunity to do that locally. So we have this pot of money that it'll be administered by the growth company, as the Treasurer has explained, and that again, like other bounce back loans, it is therefore 100% backed by government. So there is no the risk to us is therefore mitigated. But what this will really allow us to do is target those in-betweens where there's been difficulties for businesses locally, so that they can get access to this facility and really support them in their recovery. So I'm pleased to see this item on on the agenda. I'm pleased that on it, and I acknowledge all the work that David Molyneux and the Treasurer has done in making sure that we get this to this point. So it's incredibly welcome, and I'm sure that if Councillor Molyneux was here, he'd be saying this, the same on it. I know we've had a conversation about it already, and he was keen to see this brought forward too. So that's it from me, Andy. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise, and thanks for acknowledging the work of David. I think it's great that you have worked together on it, and we're bringing it forward so quickly. So thanks to Steve and all of the team as well. So, colleagues, I can't see that anyone wants to comment on this item. Therefore, I'll ask for your approval of the recommendations and the approval in principle to establish a Greater Manchester Bounce Back Loan Scheme with all of then the supporting recommendations. Is that agreed, colleagues?
Great.
Thank you. And that concludes, you'll be pleased to hear, our business for today. A lot of it, because obviously we've not been meeting as a combined authority for some time, but a substantial discussion on a number of items and discussions that we needed to have. But of course, we have taken the decision to hold a special CA on the 24th of June to discuss finance, and I hope that will send its own message to the wider world of how serious these issues are now for local and combined authorities. So thank you for your attendance, everybody. Thank you for the support from the backup team in making this first ever virtual meeting happen. You all know who you are, so thank you very much. We got through it without too many glitches. So thanks everybody, and we will meet again on the 24th of June. And that's the meeting closed.
See you then. Bye.
Bye.